So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
persistence of vision.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Persistence of Vision podcast. We are delighted to welcome you back to the podcast where we read books with people we love.
I love it. So Persistence of Vision Publishing is an Austin-based company dedicated to bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking, conversation-stimulating material, LB.
Yes.
By the way, that's LB over there.
Yes.
I'm Lance Fever Myers. If you check out the website, which is pov-publishing.com, you can read poetry by One East Myers and W. Joe Hoppe. You can read sequential art and comics by Walt Holcomb and Penny Van Horn and Shannon Wheeler and yours truly. And you can read about my new novel, which has just been released. It's called Why So Much. You can get yourself a copy at Amazon and in select bookstores around Austin. And we're having a big party, LB.
Yes.
To celebrate the launching of this company and the book. That's happening at Malvern Books.
June 8th.
June 8th. That's right. June 8th.
2019.
Correct. For those of you listening backwards into the past from the future. So
7 p.m.
We'll see you there. And we saw you there if you're one of the future people who's listening.
Future people.
We saw you there, and we loved seeing you there. So we're doing another podcast about another book.
Yes.
And we have another guest. Who is it?
We are absolutely thrilled to have the maestro himself, a man who needs no introduction, Graham Reynolds.
Yay.
Graham is a composer, a band leader, a superstar, a great low-post basketball player. What else are you, Graham?
A reader, I guess.
A reader of books.
That's a good answer.
A reader of sequential art, as Lance calls comic books, and a reader of 19 ways of looking at Wang Wei. Would you tell us about the book that you've chosen, 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei?
Sure. It's Eliot Weinberger, and I've read, he's a poetry editor and essayist and author, and I've read some of his other books. This is his book that has 19 different translations of the same Tang Dynasty poem by Wang Wei.
Yes. Now, Wang Wei is a Buddhist poet and painter who lived in the Tang Dynasty, which, if you're keeping track, was a very long time ago. That's about 1,200 years ago. The Tang Dynasty was one of the earliest of the real dynasties. We have sort of unofficial designations for dynasties that go back more than 2,000 years or so, but they really are almost the stuff of legend. The real dynasties begin not too terribly long before the Tang. What made you so interested in Chinese poetry?
There are several ways to get to this answer. The first was walking through the Met, going through a Chinese painting exhibit, and there was a painting from about 200 years ago, and it was sort of by Wang Wei and sort of not. Mm-hmm. He was in his time known primarily as a painter, later on known primarily as a poet. And part of the reason is that his poetry survives and zero of his paintings survive. Ah. But they were copied in a traditional master and tutor relationship. Each subsequent student would paint Wang Wei's painting over again. Mm. So the version I saw 200 years ago had been painted over and over and over again by various students for nearly 1,000 years or so, 800, 900 years, something like that. And so this painting by way of translation, and it was one of these scrolls, which according to Eliot Weinberger is a genre that Wang Wei helped introduce. And his mountain and streams poetry, at this point wasn't uncommon for a painter to also be a poet. And so anyway, I see this painting, and I'm interested in the painting, and I'm interested in this concept that a copy of a painting through countless other iterations was on display at the Met. Yes. And then, you Google him and what you come up with is poetry instead. And I had read a bunch of Li Po and some of the other Chinese poets, but I'd never read Wang Wei, so I started diving into that and found my way to this book.
Very interesting and very strange. It's absolutely strange.
Yeah, you're talking, and all these questions are bubbling up. Okay, so first of all, we're talking about what time period? You're like 1,200 years ago?
Yes.
So at this point, we're like 8 or 900?
It's very comparable to the time of the Trojan War, or the Trojan civilization that we discussed in an earlier podcast. But unlike the ancient Troy, this was never in any doubt as to the historicity of it.
Wait, so it wouldn't be the same time period, would it? We're talking BC, right? 1200.
No.
That's no. I think the Trojan War happened about 1200.
His years are 699 to 759.
Oh, my mistake. Oh, so 1200 years ago, of course.
Right. 699 to
759.
Gotcha.
I gratefully accept your correction.
And the Tang Dynasty is considered a golden age of Chinese culture. The painting, poetry, philosophy all flourished greatly during this time.
That's so interesting to me. I went to school and I did study a little, art history in my time, but it's all Western. It's all Western history. It's focused so heavily on Western civilization, and for Western civilization, that's a dark period. That's a very dark, very stagnant period of art. But it's interesting to find that the Chinese culture is doing so well.
Same thing happens in music. You study the history of Western music, it's going to be classical composers. It's not going to include rock and roll or R&B or African music, or just you'd have to go outside to world music history or something that specifically points at that. And I think that was certainly true when I was going to school, and to a degree I think it's still true today.
Yeah. And if you're going to learn anything, if I did take like an African art history class and that sort of thing, but those were all very specialized. So if you take just your typical your vanilla intro to art history, it's going to be all about Western civilization.
Right. And then I had a couple other angles into this book of Chinese poetry. One of my favorite classes in college was Chinese short story, and ever since then I've read Chinese literature and poetry and all this. And then even further back, when I was a kid going through boxes of books in our basement growing up, my dad had gotten his master's in history, and he had focused on Chinese history. So there were these boxes and boxes of Chinese history books that were far too complex for me to understand. But I thought China was cool as a result.
Right.
Very cool. And speaking of cool, this book has a rather cool structure. It's not a typical book. It's quite short, but you don't get the impression that it was written in a short time. Or at least I didn't.
No.
It seems like it's every single word was carefully researched and constructed, because what the book structure is, well, tell us about it.
Okay, so he starts out, it's a combination of translations of this one poem, 19 different translations, combined with little essays, reviews, analyses of the various translations. So he starts out with the introductory material, and then a character by character, first a pictogram kind of analysis. When it's written in the original Chinese, which characters have some sort of pictorial root to them that you can still see in the way the character's written. Then he goes to a transliteration, and then he goes to a word-by-word translation, not trying to turn it into a fully translated poem, but more of a literal list of definitions of these words.
Right.
And then he switches over to translations by usually by translators or other poets or both. And then analyzes each one and builds up to the finale of his favorite translation.
Yes, and most of the critiques of the translations are not glowingly favorable.
It's interesting because a lot of these poets and translators are people he edits for New Directions, and quite a few of them are people he either respects or even releases the work of. But the point of this book is to dig deeper into the challenges of translation. So quite a few of them fare poorly.
Yes, they fare poorly. And but I think, I don't know if you had the same experience, but for me, one of the real joys of the book was to confront the nature of language and its relation to consciousness.
Yeah.
In the sense that as Wittgenstein said, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. We see a description early in the book of the limitations of the Chinese language, which is another way of saying the boundaries or the shape of the Chinese language, which is very different from a language like ours that has the Roman alphabet. It is a language that has a quasi-pictographic character set. It has I believe it says the most limited number of phonemes or vowel
for
sounds.
a major language, exactly.
Yes, of any major language. And when we think about what it would be like to use to speak within those limitations, I think we're also talking about what it's like to think within those limitations, which makes us, I think, turn around and look at our own language and wonder what are the limitations of what we are able to express or even think in English.
And to me, this applies not just to spoken language or written language, but as a composer, this applies to music as well, and the way that people understand music. When in context of music, everyone grows up learning musical vocabulary, whether you study it in a deep way or you're just a casual listener. There's so much music in our lives that we have all this music vocabulary by the time we're 5 even. And certainly by the time you're an adult, you've heard countless hours of music, and you can recognize patterns and styles, and you can tell the difference between Jimi Hendrix's guitar and Eric Clapton's guitar. You can tell classical from pop. You can tell all sorts of things. You have all this information stored up about it, but your musical world is limited to this language. You can continue to expand it, but listening to music from another culture can be very difficult. And even within one's own culture, it can be very hard, where you hear a lot of criticism from, say, a more traditional classical listener or analyst would say, oh, the harmonics, the pop music is boring. It's simple. And that's because they're listening for a specific set of vocabulary and how it develops. And yet, if you look at Bach, he might be rhythmically horribly boring, and most of his pieces are. If you just took the rhythms, it might be eighth, 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 and occasionally a couple of 16th notes, or giant streams of the most boring rhythmic structure ever. With not that he wasn't capable of syncopation and other more complex rhythmic forms, but it was not the focus.
Right.
And so to someone who's listening to harmonic development, which Bach was very good at, they're going to be bored when the same chords repeat over and over again, or even in like funk or something like that, where the chord might not change at all in the course of a whole song. But if you're used to listening to that music, or if you're a creator of that music, or if you spent a lot of time with it, you listen for other things in the music, and you're interested in timbre and rhythms and the way things sound, in a way that a symphony always has the same instruments, and every piece of pop music has a different synthesizer sound, a different guitar sound, all these other things that develop that make that piece unique, that have nothing to do with harmony. Yeah. And so, the translation and the way we understand and how our minds are limited by our vocabulary, it applies across all sorts of boundaries, not just poetry.
Beyond verbal language, yes.
I find that to be a really interesting topic, with the idea of, and I relate it, of course, to more visual art, but the idea that do you appreciate, or how does it change the way you appreciate visual art by educating yourself about it. So, for example, there's, if you know what Rothko was doing or what came before Rothko, can you then gain an appreciation of what he was trying with just these color field things, and suddenly you understand the work and context and that sort of thing. But also, I think it's fair to judge things on just the aesthetic value, but you bring up an interesting point that just exposure, whether or not you study and understand who Rothko was, if you just expose yourself to his work and the work near his, it changes things. There's a difference maybe between educating yourself and actually studying the minutiae of how somebody, their life and everything, the life of Jackson Pollock from where he was born to where he died and that sort of thing. But not necessarily that, but the context or the his contemporaries and all the things that happened visually in that field. I think it's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it in those terms as far as just exposure.
Yeah, there are very different schools of thought about that. Like Glenn Gould would think that the context shouldn't matter. It's either good music or it's not good music, regardless of when it was created.
It's kind of impossible,
but
right?
it's very, very difficult to actually take things out of their context. And, it's judging any form of art is a challenging thing, but it's especially difficult if you're trying to extract it from its context.
Well, just as we, with the Western exposure to music, might find Chinese music difficult to grasp, or that someone who's a classically trained musician might struggle with pop music, we are definitely, I won't say it's difficult to appreciate necessarily, but it's definitely interesting to come across this Chinese poetry. We haven't actually even talked much about the poem itself, which, but I think that one thing we see in the book is this discussion of how Westerners really began to appreciate Chinese poetry only in the 20th century as the result of a single poet and sort of impresario of poetry, Ezra Pound.
Mm-hmm.
And this poem, the Wang Wei poem, we don't even really have a set title for it, right? Every single, or virtually every translation has a different
titles or no title, and each time the title sets you up with the first context you have for the piece.
Well, should we let the listeners know what the poem is?
I thought maybe I would read the first translation that
Great.
he offers, and Graham, maybe you would want to read the last one, the one that he approves of the most.
Yep.
So this one is really not going to meet with our author's approval here, this poem, and I think if you hear why, you'll hear why he didn't find it to be particularly authentic or poetically effective. In this translation, the title of the poem is "The Form of the Deer." So lone seem the hills, there is no one in sight there. But whence is the echo of voices I hear? The rays of the sunset pierce, slanting the forest, and in their reflection the green mosses appear. This is a translation by a guy named W.J.B. Fletcher in 1919. One of the great little drawbacks, you might say, of this poem that the author of the book points out is this line, "Whence is the echo of this voices I hear?" Well, there is no I in the Wang Wei original Chinese poem. There's no reference to the narrator at all. And what we see again and again in these translations is that in order to translate into English or Spanish, because some of these are into Spanish or French, the Western translator finds it impossible to avoid injecting this ego perspective where there is none in the original.
Yeah, they can't imagine it, the bounds of their language and the bounds of the way they think forces them into this, it's got to come from a perspective, and then they put it in this autobiographical perspective.
Yes.
Well, I'll read this other translation, which is the translations by Gary Snyder, who's a poet himself as well as a translator. And after you've read through Eliot Weinberger's analyses of all the others, you get a sense of what he's looking for.
Yes.
He wants it to stand on its own as a poem, but he wants it also to be faithful to the language. And those are difficult dual objectives to achieve. Empty mountains, no one to be seen, yet here human sounds and echoes. Returning sunlight enters the dark woods, again shining on the green moss above.
Yes. Quite a bit more powerful, I would say. But it's interesting, and that, again, when we talk about the translation across media, as you said, what was the line? And here?
Yet here.
Yet here. That's a homonym.
Right.
It's actually here like the sound here, but as I heard you say it out loud, I realized it could very easily sound like H-E-R-E. So that's just another example of the fact that every linguistic context is somewhat limited. And this, yeah, it's one thing to talk about that. It's another thing to see Weinberger really dive into these differences, these clashes that we see. And it's really marvelous.
So some of it's as simple as this light that's coming through and then shining. They can't agree whether it's shining above or shining below or
Yes.
shining, like what direction.
Is it shining? Is it reflecting? Is
Yeah.
it piercing? The original poem is shown in the book, and I say shown because, of course, I can't read Chinese, but also because that some of these characters really are very pictographic. The character for shine has little rays coming off of the bottom of it, like a light. And yeah, how do you translate that into alphanumeric characters from our alphabet? It's you can see the difficulties.
Well, I think what you said about the Western voice, not the Western translators, not really being able to comprehend a certain point of view, and it's unsettling to think that we have limitations, right? Or that there's not some sort of ultimate or objective way to look or think of things. It's strange to think that okay, all my life I'm living within a certain viewpoint, and I can't help but be in that. And it's like, I don't know, maybe it's sort of like the fish not understanding water. I mean, it's terrifying to think if someone brings up the fact that we're in water, and I'm in water, that shapes me, but I have no way to analyze that particular thing because I'm in it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, language is so limited, and we think we understand something, or we think we're communicating something, and certain basic things are fairly reliable. If I said, hand me 2 apples, you'll hand me probably what we both will consider to be 2 things. But as soon as you get very deep into language, it unravels very quickly. And there are a lot of assumptions when you're talking or describing or translating in this case. And you go up against these limitations of language. And that's part of what makes something like music or visual art or these other mediums so powerful, because they're finding other ways to express things and reveal the limitations of words. There are other things that are much easier to communicate straight up with words. So it's an amazing tool, but just to be aware of its limitations as we're making all these assumptions every day. And the way people read the same newspaper article and come away with entirely different impressions of what
if you speak
happened.
the same language.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. The exact same words, exact same source, totally different understanding. I mean, everyone understands the limitations of various categories. If you're talking about country music, a more traditionalist might think the stuff on the pop country radio is not country music. It's not real country music. Whereas obviously that radio station and those artists think that is, and everyone has their own definition of what, oh no, now it's rock and roll. Oh no, now it's country, or whatever they think it is. They think it's just, these categories that people like to argue about and enjoy arguing about are good demonstrations of how something that, everyone has a sense of the ballpark of what country music sounds like,
Yeah.
but no one can say definitively this is what country music is.
I think one of the things that makes those type of arguments get so heated is that art is such a personal thing. It can really touch you in a deep way, in a very personal way, and when you feel like someone else doesn't appreciate that or didn't get touched in the same way you did, and it's like it feels maybe a little threatening to think, but that's very important to me. That really spoke to me, and I feel very understood by that. And if you don't, then where are we?
That's why it's so easy to get into arguments about anything.
Yes, that's right. Thank goodness.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say one thing that came to mind when we were talking about translation and limitation was have you read any Murakami?
Sure, yeah.
I just recently picked up a book of his. I haven't started reading it yet, but the intro was talking about his first novel and how he first started writing. And he wrote, I think it was a very short novel, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to get this totally wrong, by the way, but it goes something like this. He started writing, and he felt like it failed, and he wasn't any good at it. And so what he did to limit himself was to write in English. And he was very limited in that. Mm-hmm. He didn't know. He couldn't wax as poetic. He couldn't let himself just go. His vocabulary was limited. So it forced him to sort of pare down to a very simplistic way of stating things, and to avoid the flowery language. And that's where his style arose. And I remember reading like several of his books before understanding that and thinking that there's like an awkward phrasing that he has, but there's something kind of appealing about that, how simple it is, working within those limitations.
Shrinking parameters is a classic way to help someone be creative.
Right.
And you get rid of all that overwhelming amount of choices that you have, and then all of a sudden you might start thinking differently. And so once someone is so deep in that minutia that's so interesting to an expert has a hard time translating to any sort of wider audience. I had a teacher who played in a traditional jazz band in high school, and we would go see them often, and it was music of the teens, 20s, 30s, and for them, this tiny little chord change, this turnaround might make this song really exciting and different from the others. And to everybody else, well, that kind of sounds like that other song and the song before that one too. These little things mean someone who knows that vocabulary so well, but in a broader context, doesn't mean a lot.
Right.
Yeah, and just going back to this whole question of linguistic limitations and so forth. One thing I was reminded of in the book is this kind of computational view of the world, and how someone like Alan Turing spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether a computer would be able to think and I put that in quotes, but whether a universal computer was possible that binary could encode any idea, for example, and it's interesting to me, and I think he proved that it could, but it's interesting to me because we think, well, of course we can encode any concept. The question is, can a computer do it with a much simpler language of binary? And yet, can a person who only speaks the language or languages he knows encode concepts that exist or have only been presented in a completely different language, as different as Chinese and English? I guess I'm reiterating a point, but I thought it was an interesting way to look at it.
I was going to say the idea of encoding really vast amounts or very sophisticated amounts of data, or like in language and whatnot. It's like, it brings to mind like encoding of DNA, right? It's like you only have 4, is it right? 4 chromosomes, 4. It's made of 4 different pieces.
4
right?
letters. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, but binary is only 2, right?
Right.
But I'm about to show my total ignorance about language. But the idea that I was trying to think in terms of anytime you write something down in a quote unquote well-formed sentence, there's a subject and a predicate.
Right.
Now, I don't know, maybe you guys can help me understand this. I don't know the answer to this, and it's a very stupid question to maybe ask when I don't know the answer, but are there languages that don't do that? Because it feels to me like that's the basic building block of all communication. Something does something, right? So there's a subject and a verb. Is that universal?
Going by this book, I would say not necessarily. I mean, it seems like as I was saying earlier, there's this character that means shine, but it's effectively is a picture of shining, of light shining, and so yeah, you could, I guess, in a way, it could function as a predicate to or as a verb, but in a real sense, it's a noun, and so yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
My linguistic history is limited, but I do think I suspect there are different ways of constructing basic communication, and just the things we know, say from this book about the Chinese language, and things that we assume in our tenses in verbs, past, present, future. They don't exist. So like, how do you communicate when you can't use a verb tense? That seems so limiting. Right. But obviously it's been working perfectly well.
Pretty well.
For
I remember thinking about like phrases like Mao Zedong would use, like he would say, let 100 flowers bloom, and it was apparently a very menacing statement about possibly being about nuclear war. And I remember when I first heard that phrase, I thought, wow, he was really very much a poet. But then later on thinking, well, maybe that's just how you say it, in a language that has a much more specific vocabulary and a much more truncated way of expressing things.
I think that's one thing that we encounter when we're reading, say, poetry from another culture is it sounds poetic because it's constructed differently from the way we would construct, and that's what we perceive as the art.
Yes.
When that's actually just the language.
Yes.
And then we're missing the actual art because we don't have the context. We don't have the vocabulary. We don't have the any sort of background in understanding what this poem means in a deeper way. It just sounds like pretty language. And that's part of what this book is so good at, is it takes something that sounds so simple at first, and by the end of reading all these translations and all these analyses of the translations, you get a much deeper sense of what the poem means, and it's not just as simple as a nice mountain and it's really quiet and pretty out there.
Yes.
Right. I wonder, and maybe this goes to the heart of why, if you want to learn a language, do it when you're young, right? The idea that, and I talk to my students about this when we talk about the art of character design in animation. It's like you create, for pictographic language, I mean, our alphabet at one time looked a lot more like the things that it was trying to represent, right? But over time, it becomes more and more abstracted. And yet, we still, when we're learning to read, we start to get sort of hardwired into not seeing it anymore. Meaning that when you and I look at the shape of the letters that spell cat, we are no longer able to actually see those for what they are. What we immediately feel and think is the imagery that it brings up, what it symbolizes.
Yes.
And it's an immediate thing. But when you're doing something like a translation, you have to go through a slightly more roundabout way to get there. And I think there's something that's very powerful about that hardwired thing that you get as a child, like learning to feel what it symbolizes rather than having to go through the steps of seeing it, decoding it, and then understanding it.
And this is very similar to making music too. I mean, if you're practicing, you're thinking, C and then D and then E and then F, and you're practicing this scale and you're very deliberate about it. But by the time you're performing, you're not thinking so literally and so point by point. And what are all these notes that I'm putting together? And what is this rhythm? You've moved past that towards actually communicating, speaking the language of music instead of thinking the language of music in a broken down step-by-step sense.
Right. Makes sense.
I think that we've added another layer here because we have this wonderful book talking about the differences in interpretation and translation, but now talking to you, Graham, we have this extra layer of what it's like to read this book and think about these ideas as a musician, and to have that framework to apply to it. So that's really wonderful. I think we're probably ready to do our lightning round at this point.
All right.
But maybe we just see if you have any things you'd like to finish off, or anything you haven't said about the book that you'd like to say.
I know that authorship is such a confusing thing, where because it's tied in our culture to finances, it's very important to determine who the author is, or how much of a percentage in a very concrete way you are the author. But when you have something like this, where a painter who painted paintings in the 700s then gets copied over for hundreds and hundreds of years, at that point, who's the author of that painting? Or when these 19 different translations of this 1,000-year-old poem are all very different and all artistic statements unto themselves. And when we understand that language is this limited thing, and essentially it's, like it's sampling, or you're taking these words that someone else created and figured out to make this little category that symbolizes this thing in the world, and then constructing it your own way, and the authorship starts to look like a very slippery thing.
Yes,
that is interesting. The Verve just got the rights to Bittersweet Symphony back.
Oh, there you go.
That says it all.
All right, lightning round. Here we go. Graham, when was the first time you remember falling in love with a book?
Ooh.
You have one? No.
I'm sure I could think about this for longer, but the first image that comes to my mind is going to the Bethany Public Library where I grew up, and there was a little corner of kids' books, and then in that corner was a series of biographies. And I would pick out a new biography, whether it was Clara Barton or Sam Houston or all sorts of figures, and so I read my way through all those histories, all of which would probably the scholarship might be seen as suspicious at this point. These might be rewritten if we looked at them now, because they read more like adventure stories than the way we might write history today. Yeah.
Right.
But I loved that little corner of the library and that set of biographies.
Nice. Has a book ever changed your mind about anything?
Well, yeah, all the time. I try to have strong opinions that I deeply believe in, that I'm willing to let go of in a second. And I know that I disagree with myself from 10 years ago, and I disagree with that self from 10 years before that, about aesthetic things, philosophical things, values and morals and ethical things. And so if I don't agree with myself, and I could think of myself as being a bad person in the past, I certainly know that 10 years from now I'm going to think back on me now and, I wasn't a very good artist then, or I made these mistakes ethically, or whatever it might be. And so I, as opinionated and stubborn as I am, which is I'm a lot of both, I also try to be open to change.
It's a very it's a noble way to live.
Well,
life,
it's aspirational. Maybe
10 years from now, you're going to think, "What a stupid way."
Exactly. Exactly.
What a terrible answer.
I know I'm wrong. Yeah. The phrase I like is this glass is already broken, and you just think of that's generally applying to physical things, like don't get too attached to anything because it's already broken. But I also think of it about my opinions. My opinion's already wrong.
Well, okay, so that was has a book ever changed your life? I mean, your mind, but has a book ever changed your life?
That's a good question, and I think I remember paintings that changed my life. And which makes me think if I thought longer and harder about it, I'd find the book that changed my life. But seeing the muralists in Bellas Artes in Mexico City when I was around 9 changed the direction of my life forever. I ended up studying Latin American history. I ended up living here. I grew up in Connecticut, and here I am 4 hours from Mexico and Texas, and this idea of this great public art movement when most of Western art was leaning towards the narrow sort of art of the individual and the self-expression, and this was something that's much broader than that. So those paintings changed my life, and I'm sure there are books that have similar impact, but that's the first piece of art, creative work that I think of as changing my life.
Fascinating. That's great. Okay, so has a book ever made you cry?
Has anything ever made you cry, Graham Reynolds?
I'm not sure that a book has. As progressive as I try to be, I definitely have a machismo streak that doesn't allow me to do certain things, and crying is one of them.
Interesting.
Wow. Interesting.
Okay, name a book you've read more than once.
19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei.
There you go.
Very
there
good.
you go.
Very good. And why did you come back to it?
Because it's so simple and so layered at the same time, and this idea of authorship, translation, and multiple ways of looking at the same thing is infinitely fascinating to me.
Okay, and final question. This is the big one.
Right.
Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
No, this is why I'm an improviser. I'm not good at memorizing things, and I don't enjoy memorizing things, and so I try to write music that other people play the written stuff, and I play the stuff I feel like playing. And I guess the same thing applies to poetry.
You're not alone. I think we've had one guest answer that one in the affirmative.
You know what I have committed to memory? An Ezra Pound Chinese-style poem.
Oh, look at that.
It's only 2 lines. Would you like to hear it?
Absolutely.
Very much.
It's called In a Station at the Metro, and it goes, "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough."
Beautiful.
So let that be a lesson to you.
I have. Already.
He may have turned into a fascist, but Ezra Pound brought Chinese poetry to the Western world.
Well, he's an interesting guy, isn't he? I mean, he was also interesting in that he was a serious poet, but probably better known or more important as a kind of cheerleader, inspirer, organizer, introducer of poets to each other and other artists.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting, but
He's best known as a lyric in a Bob Dylan song.
oh, of course. Well, we want to thank the maestro, Graham Reynolds, composer, poetry fan, band leader, superstar, low post basketball player.
Where can listeners hear some of your work?
Oh, I'm easy to track down. Whatever service you use, whether it's Spotify or YouTube or whatever you like to listen to music on. I've got a lot of music out there in the world, and then I perform all the time, a lot in Austin, but I travel around too. But I'm very Googleable.
Graham Reynolds is an Austin treasure. I highly recommend checking him out if you haven't heard him already.
Google him.
Yes. Thank you, Graham. This has been fantastic.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for another fun-filled episode of Persistence of Vision podcast. You can check out the Persistence of Vision Publishing website at pov-publishing.com, where you'll find comics, poetry, original prose, and a link to read the brand new novel by Lance Fever Myers, Why So Much? So check it all out and join us on the 8th at Malvern Books. And we love you, and God damn you all.
Thanks, folks. Bye.